In discussing Theodor Adorno's musicological analysis of Wagner's oeuvre, I attempted as much as possible to avoid those elements of Adorno's writing which arise entirely apart from his conceptions of musicianship. In doing so, I intended to focus on elements of Wagner's work which might be edifying, even on a profoundly introductory level, to someone interested in the elements of musical composition which most acclaim Wagner to even the harshest critic. This focus could only be introductory, however. The reality is that In Search of Wagner does not allow a comfortable separation of musicology and social theory, nor does Adorno suggest that this is the case. Indeed, the first full chapter of the text is titled Social Character, and its subject is exactly that. It is an interrogation of Wagner as a man. This interrogation is carried over into the second chapter, Gesture, and blends seamlessly with Adorno's occasionally opaque criticisms of Wagner's musicianship. It is for this reason I objected previously to Zizek's claim that Adorno's essay is, quote, grounded in the highest musicological analysis. Rather, In Search of Wagner is grounded in a deep ambivalence about the significance of Wagner, the historical figure, in a grudging respect for his works and accomplishments, opposing a visceral disgust of his attitudes and identity. That Adorno leverages a well-realized musical education for his critique does not make it any more primary in the work. Before examining the details, some background exposition is necessary. Adorno was Jewish, and Wagner's expressed opinion on Judaism is hardly a question of historical debate. Less well known, however, is that Wagner at times was in fact a political revolutionary. The details of Wagner's political life and motivations deserve a video unto themselves, but for our purposes it is sufficient to know he fled Dresden in 1849 to avoid an arrest warrant for revolutionary activity, that he wrote a long essay that same year entitled Art and Revolution, and that Adorno was well aware of this history. There is a sense in which Adorno's own Frankfurt School is a child of that same revolutionary history in which Wagner participated, perhaps in a sense as a proto-third positionist rather than a true leftist, and this may in fact be the root of Adorno's animus and fascination with Wagner. After all, with Wagner, we have an artist, a young revolutionary, and shall we say a figure regarded as controversial amongst German Jews. All of these things in the 1840s. Perhaps to Adorno, life imitates artist a century hence. In any case, as I'm not myself a critical theorist, I will make every attempt to keep further psychoanalysis to a minimum. The first chapter of In Search of Wagner, Social Character, begins with a vignette discussing the failure of Wagner's first completed and produced opera, Das Liebesverbot. The purpose of reference to this relatively obscure work is to illuminate what Adorno sees as Wagner's hypocrisy, or indeed Wagner's hypocritical character. Adorno quotes the artist himself, quote, "The ground note of my interpretation was directed against puritanical hypocrisy and hence led to the celebration of free sensuality." Adorno contrasts this with the opening scene of Rienzi, in which the attempted abduction of Irene, the titular Rienzi's sister, is interrupted by the Colonna family. We shall discuss the significance of some of the characters involved in a moment, and in the meantime skate past Adorno's implication here that a defense of free sensuality also demands at least neutrality on the question of abducting a young woman for unspecified but heavily suggested purpose. It suffices to note that to Adorno, this is an early instance of Wagner's hypocritical character. Adorno expands upon his analysis of Rienzi in deeply Marxist terms, quoting heavily from the libretto before stating, quote, "The Roman insurrection is directed against a libertine style of life and not against the class enemy." Although to this point Adorno has made no reference to Wagner's later politics, it's reasonable to interpret this analysis as an attack on Wagner's revolutionary bona fides from a leftist perspective. And the attack is reasonable, although maybe a bit of a prisoner of its moment. Rienzi was fully written by 1840, well before, for example, Marx had so much as completed his doctoral dissertation. The characters here become critical. Rienzi as a revolutionary plebeian, facing a corrupted patrician nobility in his revolution. The source of Adorno's discontent with this framing, then, is that Colonna, who come to Irene's rescue, are a patrician family. Even more, Rienzi repeatedly declares that he has no quarrel with Colonna's son and Irene's beloved Adriano, and he endorses their love in Adriano himself in no uncertain terms. Adorno also draws, or perhaps constructs, examples of Wagner's hypocrisy from the objective circumstances of his life. He describes Wagner seeking a salary, via list, from various nobles as a capacity to, quote, "achieve bourgeois goals at the cost of his bourgeois integrity." In the same paragraph, returning to libretto, Adorno argues that Sigmund, hero de Valcourt, is a projection of this precise lack of character. In one of the most drastic analytical leaps taken in the piece, Adorno contends that Sigmund's comportment in the opening scenes as he appeals for sympathy is an example of this revolutionary hypocrisy. That Sigmund is, quote, "a revolutionary who conciliates the despised members of the middle class while recounting heroic deeds long past." Never mind that the ostensible representation of that despised middle class, Hunding, continues to be the primary antagonist of the opera and that Sigmund will die in battle with him. Never mind also that, both in the tale Sigmund initially recounts and in the driving conflict of the opera, the mission is essentially romantic, not political. Even if we are to take Adorno's class war reading of Wagner's work at exactly face value, Adorno himself acknowledges there is another not unpopular Marxist reading of Sigmund's, or indeed Wagner's, behavior, writing that, quote, a lack of restraint in begging could suggest a particular independence of bourgeois social norms, but here it has the opposite meaning. That second sentence is not further justified. I won't bother to repeat the various clever insults Adorno indulges himself in. What we have here is really a declaration by a renowned scholar in the Western revolutionary tradition that the intent in a specific moment of ambiguity in Wagner's work is wholly counter-revolutionary or reactionary. This declaration pushes Wagner away from that tradition. It serves to disassociate Adorno's philosophical lineage from what he seems as unseemly or reprehensible in Wagner. In presenting Wagner as a revolutionary hypocrite, or perhaps an insincere revolutionary, Adorno leaves little space for nuance and in essence writes off the possibility of third position between leftist revolutionary instinct and a status quo defense which is in his mind tantamount to fascism. Adorno further indulges himself in his critiques of the most immediate aesthetic elements of Wagner and his work. He identifies a fascist tendency in the grandiosity of Rienzi, the character's vestments, writing that they exemplify, quote, self-praise and pomp, features of Wagner's entire output and the emblems of fascism. In contrast, Wagner's villains and laughable characters. To Adorno, quote, all the rejects of Wagner's work are caricatures of Jews. He cites Mime, Alberich, and Beckmesser as examples. The descriptions and portrayals of these characters I leave to the individual to experience directly in the libretto or in the operas themselves. Adorno's deepest personal indulgence in the text comes out of a psychoanalytic interpretation of Wagner's villainous caricatures. I again refrain from recounting exactly Adorno's description of Wagner's own physical appearance. The gist is that he calls him properly ugly, and directly referencing Mime argues that Wagner, quote, pursues his victims down to the level of their biological nature, because he saw himself as only having barely escaped being a dwarf. Without dwelling too long on the depth of resentment necessary to launch this particular psychoanalytic attack, I will point out that the very personal aesthetic critique here is actually rather similar to Adorno's previous identification of Wagner as a revolutionary hypocrite. The argument is in essence that Wagner properly belongs to and thus betrays the class of victims that he caricatures. As a brief aside, Adorno's critiques of Wagner's music take generally the exact opposite tone of his ideas about Wagner's character. He repeatedly describes Wagner as dilettantish, directly referencing his colleague Thomas Mann, and indeed argues his vision and artistry is fundamentally so. He makes oblique references to, quote, slips in modulation or melodic weakness, without actually indicating the moments in Wagner's scores which suffer these errors. And he claims Wagner, quote, found it hard to achieve standards of good musicianship. This particular video doesn't concern itself with the musicology any farther. What is of interest is that, on the level of musicology, Adorno takes an elitist perspective, whereas on the level of character and comportment, he takes a perspective that Wagner is a two-faced revolutionary, a failed proletarian, and a traitor to the lower parts of society. In any case, what is ignored in Adorno's critiques of Wagner's character, both his critiques rising from the stories he tells or his own behaviors, is a possibility of an authentic worldview set apart from a Marxist understanding of class conflict. Rienzi is perhaps the most political of Wagner's major works, serves as an ideal vehicle to a more nuanced understanding of his worldview. The libretto is unambiguous in its revolutionary conception. Rienzi's revolutionaries repeatedly call for the downfall of the noble families, of which Adriano is a representative. To the hero Rienzi, however, Adriano's noble birth is no impediment to his noble comportment. Even Rienzi's vendetta against the Colonna family for the death of his brother is muted in his exclamations of Adriano's personal virtue. This dimension of personal virtue is critical in Rienzi. Depending on the version of the opera, Rienzi's own final lines are a curse on the, quote, degenerate folk unworthy of the name Romans. A plainer moral statement couldn't be made, and yet Adorno, whether through ideological myopia or simple deceit, neglects it entirely. He neglects it when comparing Wagner's youthful endorsement of free sensuality to the attempted abduction of Irene. He neglects it when considering unsympathetic caricatures such as Mime and Alberich, and he neglects it most notably in his inability to see Wagnerian heroes as anything other than class representatives. To Adorno, Sigmund is an inadequate avatar of the proletariat, rather than a man incensed by crimes against romance. Siegfried's abuse of Mime is a manifestation of the ruling class's contempt for the victimized, rather than arising from the hero's frank disgust with the dwarf's rotten character. And Rienzi, last of the tribunes, fights not for the rejuvenation of a heroic Roman spirit, but for a petty and dishonest resentment. With the perspective that Wagner's heroes are not mere class representatives, but are individual moral characters, we erase any sense of hypocrisy or contradiction in his work, if not in his own life, although I have no desire to contend with the moral content of his personal dealings. Good and evil exist as moral quantities apart from class affiliation, and a Rienzi can coexist with an Adriano, at least as long as their corroded society can bear the weight of their moral stature. The validity of Adorno's class analysis will vary depending on the reader's epistemological preference. Likewise, I expect that some will find the virtue ethics I've presented in contrast too simplistic. There is no question that Wagner's oeuvre is sufficiently rich to bear both perspectives and many more besides. Regardless of the viewer's posture towards Adorno's critiques, I believe it's edifying to experience and investigate this sort of analysis, both for its unique insights and its profound limitations. Sei gesund for now.